Good evening, Trapped in History followers. I appreciate you for joining me for episode 64. You are Trapped in History with me, your host, Robbie Malcolmson. I'm finally into the second semester content of AP European History. I am already finishing up, or I have finished up, Unit 6, the introduction of the effects of industrialization, or the effects of that. And I figured I would go through and do an overarching episode here tonight about the kind of a summarized sort of narrative view of this unit. And then maybe take some close deep dives, as many of you are probably already halfway through this particular unit, or if you happen to be a little bit behind and you did not kill Napoleon by Christmas, then you may be needing this particular podcast. So I'm going to try to speed in through more of these, get into Unit 7, get into that imperialism, that nationalism, the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, and kind of keep progressing on, building up all the way through that Franco-Prussian War, all the way, getting as close as I can to eventually 1914 for Unit 8. I am trying a little something new this year. I've shortened down and tried to get through more of Unit 6 and 7, more of a summary form to get kind of 2 weeks ahead. I am going to do my first ever film analysis in which I'm going to use All Quiet on the Western Front on Netflix to talk about the political side, the nationalistic side, the effects of Industrial Revolution, I guess as a way of kind of weaving in themes from Unit 6 and 7, as well as of course, the beginning of Unit 8. And again, I'm going to try it this year. I've spent so many years now just chasing the pacing guide, trying to get done on time. And I think, and in many instances, especially with Unit 9, later Unit 7, sometimes I can get going and trying to get so many of the topics for the AP. I think we often lose substance and meaning and connection for the students. And I don't want to lose the same sort of passion that I had in the first semester talking about art and philosophy and all these deeper connections. So I've tried to, even though we've gone faster in Unit 6, I've tried to be able to get through this unit in 2 weeks rather than my normal 3-week window. So that way I can still plan to get finished with my content by spring break. For us, that's really usually the last week of March and the first week of April, we have our spring break for 2 weeks where I teach at. So I like to be able to get back and have a 3-week period or so where we can review, do some kind of activities, work on some writing stuff, be able to do a mock exam, and then more importantly, be able to subsequently discuss that mock exam, break it down, look at where our kind of weak points are, and of course, really revisit the broader themes of the school year, being able to master the centuries. We do all kinds of things like the chronology game that I've been able to kind of weave in and with the help of Kent the Sage and other teachers. I do the centuries game that I made on Google Slide, working on, basically going over themes and reminding those skills like HIP. My classes right now, they seem to be doing better in writing than any class I've had in the past, but we still struggle quite a bit with multiple choice. And I think a lot of it is psychological in terms of getting too stressed out, too amped up when we get into like testing sort of scenarios. And students can quickly forget the skills that they have shown themselves, more importantly, not just me, with informative assessments in class. They can do it. So we've been working again on multiple choice Mondays. We always look at some kind of a primary source or secondary source and tackle at least 3 or 4 multiple choice questions. And this is where I try as best I can to be able to try to replicate sort of these situations and be able to put like a 4-minute timer up, let them go through that Heimler method, sort of going through the process. And then more importantly, we come together before leaving class and discuss that. But of course, not taking away at all the meaningfulness of teaching. I don't want to be chasing the test. I want to teach history meaningfully, and as a byproduct, hopefully that they're able to pass the AP exam for them. Like, they're going to do well in my class. More than likely, they're working really hard. The passing the AP exam is for them, not for me. It is for getting them to the period of time where they can do extremely well. So that's just kind of me on my soapbox. I haven't had a little bit of a moment in which I've shared kind of what's going on for me right now. And this is where I'm at going into this semester and progressing forward. So let's dive on in to this deeper summary of the effects of industrialization Again, one of my favorite units of the school year. I think it's extremely interesting. I also believe that this is, to me at least, and what I've seen in my 7 years of teaching AP, this is usually the easier chapter out of all the ones that we have done as far as like the results I get, the effects I get. It's a little bit easier to understand and read the primary sources for the kids. The language is a little bit more modern. The translations are a little bit more modern. You know, you're in that 19th century window into the early 20th century. It's becoming a little bit easier for students to understand these sort of themes. So here we begin. We begin in England in the late 1700s, and for centuries, the rhythm of life has been slow and relatively seasonal. Most people live in villages. Work is tied to daylight, weather, and tradition. Then, almost without warning, the pace of life accelerates. Smoke rises where fields once stood. Machines hum where silence once ruled. People flood into cities that were never meant to hold them, at least at that capacity and at that speed. Technology quickly advances, rapid population movement, and urbanization further fuels the change. Consequently, Great Britain became the origin of the Industrial Revolution. Now, industrialization does not simply change how people work. It transforms how people live, think, and understand progress itself. Unit 6 of AP European History, The Effects of Industrialization, is not just about factories and machines and mines. It covers the effects of this, about that human cost of economic transformation, and the philosophical debate over whether progress can be moral if it leaves suffering in its wake. Industrialization began in Great Britain not by accident, but because of ideal geography and an abundance of resources and raw materials, as well as social change. We can't also overlook militarily, it was relatively untouched by the Napoleonic Wars, where the rest of Europe cannot be able to say that. And that has to make at least somewhat of a difference. Britain possessed vast amounts of coal and iron, navigable rivers, and political stability, and a growing population. But one of the most disruptive changes came before the factories ever opened during the agricultural revolution, as we visited earlier in the school year, and with an event entitled the Enclosure Movement. Parliamentary enclosure laws allowed wealthy landowners to fence off common lands that peasants had relied on for generations. Small farmers were pushed off the countryside, stripped of economic independence, and forced into cities in search of wage labor. Urbanization exploded, not because cities were ready, but because people had nowhere else to go for land, for housing, for job opportunities. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds became industrial giants almost overnight, crowded, polluted, and chaotic. Inside factories, work was no longer tied to skill or craftsmanship, but to time and discipline. Machines dictated the pace. Bells replaced church clocks, and a missed shift could mean starvation. Men, women, and children often worked 12 to 16 hours a day, most often 6 days a week. Coal mines swallowed boys as young as 8 years old. Textile fabric factories employed girls whose small fingers could repair machines, but whose lost limbs just as easily. Wages were low, injuries common, and housing extremely overcrowded. A perfect petri dish, so to speak, for the spread of diseases like cholera and other issues. Industrial cities grew faster than sanitation systems. Sewage ran through the streets. Disease spreads quickly. Life expectancy in some industrial centers dropped dramatically compared to many rural areas. This new reality forced Europeans to ask a terrifying philosophical question. Was industrial progress actually improving human life, or simply enriching a few at the expense of many? As many of you teachers know, one of the main topics in this unit, in a philosophical and ideological sense, is utilitarianism with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And that it kind of goes into that overarching guiding question for the rest of the unit. Now, as many of you know, at the beginning there in Unit 6, you're going to dive into 1851. Great Britain will showcase its achievements at the famous Crystal Palace during the Great Exhibition of the works of industry of all nations. Inside of its massive iron and glass walls were machines, textiles, engines, and symbols of human ingenuity. To the middle and upper classes, the Crystal Palace represented triumph, victory, proof that industrial capitalism delivered wealth, power, and national greatness. There's that nationalism kind of guiding again, working on it, building up, ratcheting up as we are getting closer and closer to World War I. But outside the famous exhibition halls, workers were turned to cramped housing, polluted air, and exhausting labor. Industrialization had created two Europes living side by side, one of comfort and confidence, the other of survival and exhaustion, often just merely blocks away from each other in many of these cities. And we also saw this in many cities in the United States. Industrialization shattered traditional gender roles, but not always in liberating ways. For example, women entered factories in large numbers, but often paid less than men for the same work. Children were valued precisely because they were cheap, they were obedient, and expendable. Children are not just going to willingly and openly know how to form labor unions to fight for those greater working conditions. Public awareness around these cities throughout Europe slowly grew over time, resulting in, as reformers and journalists and philosophers like Flora Tristan from France, for example, as a utopian socialist, they are all going to be exposing the realities of factory life. Parliamentary investigations documented horrific working conditions, especially for children. Outrage, anger led to early labor laws, including the famous Factory Acts, that limited child labor hours and mandated basic safety measures. These laws were imperfect and unevenly enforced, but they represented a new idea. The state had a responsibility to protect workers, not just property. Now again, many of this was inspired by those reformers through isms, as we would call them, or ideologies like utilitarianism, socialism, utopianism, eventually even communism is bringing out a lot of these complaints. In terms of utilitarianism, and I like to teach my students in terms of thinking of it in a generalized philosophical way of the logic of whatever is best for the majority is what usually is the right or moral action to take. Often in psychology and other exercises, you have exercises like the famous trolley scenario of choosing the death of one person in order to save five as sort of an archetypal metaphor or exercise that people may do in utilitarianism discussions or problem solving. But as far as utilitarianism, famous thinkers for AP Euro like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill argue that policies should aim for, and I quote, the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Utilitarians often supported industrial capitalism, but believed it should be reformed to reduce suffering through education, laws, and rational planning. As for socialism and utopian socialism, others argue that Industrial capitalism itself was the problem. As I mentioned earlier, Flora Tristan, these early socialists bringing up how inequality was baked into the batter of the system. She often connected workers' rights to women's rights, arguing that true progress required solidarity across class and gender lines. She's another one like Mary Wollstonecraft from Unit 4, not on the topic of education, but definitely helping that first wave feminism. I think strongly, I think there's evidence that over time, not just in America, but women working in these factories and doing many of the same jobs or similar jobs, advocating for their own rights, is obviously going to help and eventually leading to suffrage, the right to vote, women be able to hold public office, and eventually even, of course, the second wave feminism that we see in the latter half of the 20th century. Now, utopian socialists, there's more of them, but I just mainly focus on Flora Tristan for now. And they imagined cooperative communities where workers shared profits and dignity. While many of these experiments often failed, their ideas still planted the seeds for later labor movements and also political reforms. And then comes, of course, the labor unions and this idea of collective power. As conditions in these factories and living conditions when they're not at work worsened, workers began to start finally organizing together. Labor unions formed to demand higher wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. And governments initially banned the unions. They considered it a threat. You can't overlook the fact that many of these tycoons, these factory owners, lobby themselves, and they're connected to those politicians. So there's obviously some resistance, especially within capitalism, on banning unions or not listening to these unions, and sometimes violently putting them down. And governments, more importantly, especially the conservative side, after the Napoleonic Wars, after the French Revolution, especially as we get to the revolutions of 1848, although they failed, governments feared that these would lead to revolutions, these labor union sort of things. And many times when they were not able to collectively bargain and find an agreement, it led to strikes and protests, and collective action slowly is going to kind of force the politicians to find recognition for these issues. By the mid-19th century, the middle of the 1800s, labor movements had become a permanent force in European politics, reshaping laws, economics, and the meaning of citizenship itself. So let's take a dive in a specific source. For example, I'm going to go ahead and cover one that I haven't covered in class yet. Many of my students tomorrow are going to dive in and do a source from the Communist Manifesto. I'm going to introduce them to Marx and Engels. And then on Friday, we're going to be having a test. We kind of had to do a study guide today because I have a weird sort of meeting day tomorrow for the whole day of school. You know how it is in schools. There's always kind of things that come up and distractions that cause us to adjust our pacing all the time. But since communism is going to be such a major ideology going forward in the classes of the school year, all the way through at least halfway through Unit 9, I really wanted to make sure we ended on that and how socialism evolves into this idea of communism. So let's look at something different. I didn't want to pull necessarily from something as common as the Communist Manifesto, but I definitely wanted to still use something that addressed a writer that helped Karl Marx write that book. So Friedrich Engels was a German philosopher and a political economist. I will put this in the show notes. And we're looking at where he wrote The Condition of the Working Class in England. And this is written during when Engels lived there in Manchester. So, he has kind of obviously an eyewitness point of view. And this is going to be around 1845. So 3 years before the revolutions of 1848 that are caused by many social issues, but also other issues that are arising as well. But let's just see what he says here. And let's practice a little bit of HIP. Let's practice a little bit of historical context and historical situation, intended audience, point of view, purpose, maybe even limitations. And you can use this archetype to apply it to other topics that you are doing. So Engels says in The Condition of the Working Class in England, the industrial system has brought the mass of workers together in great cities, where they are crowded into wretched dwellings, deprived of all cleanliness, ventilation, and health. The streets are narrow, the houses badly built, damp, and filthy. Disease spreads unchecked, and the worker, worn out by excessive labor, poisoned by bad air and poor food, is condemned to an early death. Civilization has here reached its highest point and its lowest. These conditions, and there's so much overwhelming evidence that what they said is true. There's also evidence in his writing that this is another effect of Romanticism, especially on writing. And even though we focus on more of the literature part of Romanticism in Unit 7, as we transition into my personal favorite, which is realism. But I've also really enjoyed learning more and teaching more about Romanticism over the last 7 years. Now, as far as the historical context, the historical situation of a writing like this from Engels, during this mature phase of Great Britain's Industrial Revolution, this is when factory production and coal mining and the urban growth had fundamentally transformed cities like Manchester. I always compare Manchester to, for American students, think of cities like Chicago early on, and Pittsburgh early on, and Detroit as they're early in those industrial-like conditions in New York. As I had said earlier in the narration, Britain was the world's leading industrial power. Yet this economic dominance masked severe urban overcrowding, public health crisis, child labor, and class polarization. The work emerges at a moment when industrial capitalism was no longer experimental but entrenched, and when early labor unrest, like the Luddite protest of breaking the machines even that they worked on as a form of protest, and Chartism, like the famous Chartist that we can see as an illustrative example in our class, signaled this evidence of this growing resistance. Engels, his observations coincide with the intellectual formation of modern socialism, just prior to his collaboration later on with Karl Marx, placing the text at a critical transition point between a social critique of these issues and also revolutionary ideological theory for social adjustment. Now, the next part of HIP, one of my personal favorite, which is intended audience. And think in terms of this, Engels, he wrote primarily for educated upper and middle class European readers, particularly, for example, liberal reformers who, of course, like more change and have led a lot of the revolutionary fervor throughout European history around this time and before this time. These kind of people believed industrial capitalism could be morally improved. German and continental intellectuals unfamiliar with Britain's urban conditions could have been his intended audience, as well as political thinkers engaged in debates over political economy. Importantly, the intended audience was not the working class itself, which many students often guess when I ask them this off this source, but those with cultural, political, and economic power who either defended or ignored the industrial system. Engels aimed to shock complacent readers by confronting them with the conditions they benefited from but rarely witnessed. And in American history, I always think of the progressives and the muckrakers and people like Upton Sinclair in the jungle and the shocking nature of the Chicago meatpacking industries, or writers like Jacob Riis with slums and tenements, or Ida Tarbell with the oil companies. Now, the point of view of Engels is important, kind of broke down in this case in 3 different sort of possible ways to look at it. And for me, if students are even able to get one of these and kind of discuss it with their own logic, with CER, claim, evidence, and reason, I'm extremely proud of them for that. And I see him with more of 3 intersecting identities. First, as a socialist critic of capitalism like Marx. Engels viewed capitalism not as a flawed system needing reform, but as structurally exploitative. He interpreted poverty, disease, and overcrowding as systemic outcomes, not just accidents or moral failures of workers. The whole system is corrupt and needed to be amended. He's also an insider and an outsider as a perspective, which makes him extremely unique being in this area. So as a son of a factory owner, Engels possessed intimate knowledge of the bourgeois economic logic, yet he rejected his own class interest. This position allowed him to critique capitalism both in empirical detail and in ideological clarity. He can also be seen as what's called a proto-Marxist lens. Though Marxism has not fully yet been articulated, Engels already is framing society in terms of this class conflict that Marx will be writing about in the Communist Manifesto and other writings, and then it's also echoed by people like Vladimir Lenin later. And this is seeing that the bourgeoisie, this upper class the proletariat themselves, the working class, locked in an antagonistic relationship with each other. They're already set up in the system to be at war with each other. In his observations, they are going to lay the groundwork later for Marxist concepts such as alienation and exploitation, and of course, class struggle. Now, this POV, this point of view, leads Engels to interpret industrial cities not as unfortunate byproducts of progress, but as evidence of capitalism's moral failure. And I would say one of the more important and most often used by students is determining the purpose of a document. In this case, Engels' purpose is explicitly political and ideological, not just merely being informative and descriptive. He's definitely being persuasive here. He's informing in a way that's supposed to have shock value to it. And one of these 4 ways that I wrote down is to expose the lived realities of industrial workers. Giving him further credence is the fact that he lives there in this particular city. He also is doing this to maybe undermine liberal narratives that equated industrial growth with human progress. Because there were liberals that saw capitalism and industrial growth as also humans are progressing forward. But again, with those core questions, how do we progress forward when there's also so much misery and suffering also going on? My third point, to argue that suffering is inherent to capitalism, not correctable through charity alone. And again, there was charity, but it cannot be corrected only through that. There's got to be genuine political change from the top down. Many of these tycoons are not just going to make these moral changes on their own. The fourth point, to mobilize intellectual support for systemic change through this idea of socialism. The text that he does that we read earlier, to transform this into a moral outrage, into a structural critique, he's trying to push readers toward the conclusion that only radical economic reorganization, not this sort of piecemeal diplomatic reform, could truly restore human dignity. It's almost like the idea of you almost got to shake up the Etch-a-Sketch as the old toy sort of way of looking at the metaphor. Now, in terms of limitations, it sounds as though like I'm just really talking about only really the positives of Engels' work here, but it's also important as a historian or history student to try to figure out any limitations. And here's some possible ones. One of them is, of course, ideological selectivity. For example, Engels emphasizes the worst conditions to strengthen his critique, sometimes overlooking the fact that there is regional variation across Britain and other cities. There's also gradual improvements from the early labor legislation as labor laws progress, as more and more people are becoming informed, and workers who experience somewhat of a modest upward mobility in terms of classes, from maybe going from working class to lower middle class or up from that. He's also, this lacks a long-term perspective. It makes sense given the time period that he's doing, but he's writing at a moment of crisis. And Engels could not afford or not fully account for the fact that there will be later reforms, such as those factory acts, the Mines Act, the 10 Hours Act. There's going to be public health initiatives. There'll be things like the Sunday school movement, the temperance movement. We're still in that time period of abolitionist movement. And also going to see the legalization of labor unions, which definitely finally gives the workers some leverage to be able to negotiate or collectively bargain with these mine owners as much as they possibly could. He also has a very deterministic framework, and what I mean by that, he has this emerging Marxist lenses that led him to interpret events almost exclusively through just a class conflict lens. So it's maybe an overgeneralization, maybe an oversimplification of the problems, that this is merely due to the fact that the classes socially are at war with each other. Like the working class is always going to be at war with the bourgeoisie, or even above that in terms of the upper class, and that these wealthy landowners, these wealthy factory owners, the mine owners. And this is going to limit the recognition that there are other factors such as religious differences, cultural, or gender that also enforces or has impacts on these particular issues. And these limitations do not necessarily negate or take away the source's value, but they require historians, all of us are students, to contextualize Friedrich Engels' claims both as ideology and his moment in time. He's trying to give the best perspective as he possibly can. Now, to wrap up the show tonight, we're around that 30-minute mark. We'll go a little bit over that. To leave you with something here, just think of it in terms of this as a student or as a teacher, especially if you're a new teacher in AP Euro. Industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, it forces us to truly wrestle with the uncomfortable truth, and that is progress is rarely neutral. It creates wealth, power, and innovation, but it also leads to suffering, inequality, and moral reckoning at times. The industrial age, it forces Europeans or forced them to redefine philosophically what justice, fairness, and the responsibility meant in a modern society, hence modernity. A lot of these questions are going on, especially in that Victorian era of England. The question raised in Unit 6, the effects of industrialization, are not just historic, they are still obviously with us today. So, my friends, that leads us to how we normally end our episodes, especially on content, and that is our 3 philosophical questions to end the episode to leave you, the listener, the thinker, the teacher, the student, the history enthusiast, with questions to debate with your friends, with your colleagues, with other ideas, with yourself, just to kind of ruminate on. And my first question tonight to leave you with is, can a society call itself, quote unquote, progressive if economic growth depends on human suffering? Number 2, is it the responsibility of governments to limit freedom in the marketplace to protect workers? And if so, where is the line? To what extent? Number 3, does technological advancement make us more human, or does it risk turning people into tools of efficiency? Yet another discussion. We see that discussion even in schools over the last this century so far, as technology increases, as AI increases, as we more bring technology into education. Are we treating our students more like tools of efficiency, more like consumers in sort of a system? This is going to be a moral struggle or utilitarian struggle, not just in schools, but businesses and just throughout the different fabrics of society. So as always, my friends, keep questioning the past in order to understand the present, and be contagious.